Hey folks, it's Mike from the Secure the Grid Coalition. Today is a banner day in grid security. So in the state of New Hampshire today, there was a hearing on New Hampshire House Bill 1723. Now, why is this important? Because this particular bill is an act requiring utilities and electric grid operators to assess and report the vulnerability of high voltage transformers to geomagnetic and electromagnetic disturbances, and to recommend mitigation measures to protect the state electric infrastructure. So you may not live in New Hampshire, so why is this important to you? Well, if you've been following grid security in the last several decades, we've gotten exactly nowhere on many of the major threats to the electric grid, which is the most critical of critical infrastructures. So what happened today needs to be duplicated across the country in other state legislatures. So I'm going to be presenting the New Hampshire hearing that happened today. The Secure the Grid Coalition was represented by Tommy Waller, and I'm also including the entire hearing here. So also you're going to see testimony from a couple of the utilities. I'm not going to offer any comment here. I think the hearing completely speaks for itself. If you listen to Tommy Waller's testimony and you listen to the testimony of the utilities, I think you will come to your own conclusions on New Hampshire House Bill 1723. Now, the question for you is your state going to do the same thing and protect its state electric grid? I've got to be honest with you folks. I've been doing this for over a decade, and the chances of the federal government solving all of our problems is very limited, let's say. So how are we going to solve the grid security problem? You're going to solve it in your state. That's exactly what we're going to do. So I'd encourage you to watch this hearing, and then I would encourage you to send it to your state representative, your state lawmakers, and encourage every state in the United States to save our transformers. Look in the description of this video for links to the full legislative hearing today, which I'm just including the House Bill 1723 part, but if you want the original State of New Hampshire video, I'll link that. I'm also going to link some other references to this topic. What I hope you will do is share this video with your state legislators and demand, don't just ask them, demand that they protect your family by protecting the electric grid in your state.
I will now introduce this bill, House Bill 1723, requiring utilities and electric grid operators to assess and report the vulnerability of high voltage transformers to geomagnetic and electromagnetic disturbances, and to recommend mitigation measures to protect the state electric infrastructure. And to introduce this bill to the committee, I'll call on Representative Rita Mattson.
Mr. Chair, for the record, Rita Mattson. So to introduce it, I was just going to read the act, but you just did that. So I can read the whole bill, but I don't think that's necessary.
No, you don't want to do that.
We'll be here till tomorrow. So what it basically it is the power companies would need to do a survey to tell us all of the extra high voltage transformers in their system, which ones are most vulnerable, and which ones have the longest lead times. So for planning purposes for replacement if necessary. And that's basically what the bill is. But so I would like to introduce the co-writer of the bill, Mr. Tommy Waller from the Center for Security Policy, and he's going to explain in detail what this means.
Okay, and before we hear from Mr. Waller, Lieutenant Colonel Waller, retired. I just want to point out that while this sign in front of us says that this is HB 1723-FN, which would imply that it has a fiscal note, the bill, in fact, does not have a fiscal note. So I just want to make that clear to everyone. And now I look forward to hearing from Lieutenant Colonel, retired Tommy Waller, sorry.
Thank you, sir. So, Tommy Waller, work for the Center for Security Policy. We're a 501c3 nonprofit based out of Washington, D.C. As a 501c3 nonprofit, our mission is to provide uncompromised analysis on what threatens our republic, and then unconventional solutions to keep Americans safer. Part of how we provide that uncompromised analysis is that we refuse funding from governments, from any foreign sources, or from any industry that can profit off of our recommendations. So we're here purely to represent the public interest. As mentioned, my background in the Marines, served as an infantry officer, but about halfway through my career, transitioned to the civilian sector and have been working for the center for about 14 years. During that time, I was asked to lead the nationwide Secure the Grid Coalition. So this is a group of national security experts, engineers, people who really their purpose is to secure this infrastructure that we cannot live without. And in doing so, we provide threat briefings routinely, educational material routinely on these various threats. Last year, I provided a threat briefing to members of this legislature and was inspired to see that those members went and actually put forth a resolution at the National Conference of State Legislators to address this threat, which we'll talk about briefly. I also want to just clarify that as a 501c3, we mostly do education for policymakers. There are times when we're asked for the solutions and we sit down and we work through those. And so this bill was created in consultation with the engineers, lawyers, policymakers, over a series of months, many people who gave a lot of time to think through what is the best procedure to move forward and actually see some action to protect our critical infrastructure. So it was a group effort, a coalition effort, and I want to thank this committee for hearing it. Let me just briefly mention that our coalition seeks to address 6 threats to the grid: government policies, supply chain vulnerabilities, cyber, physical sabotage, and then both man-made and electromagnetic spectrum threats from nature. This bill addresses those electromagnetic spectrum threats, specifically one known as GIC, or geomagnetically induced currents. So briefly, just to explain, when a nuclear weapon is detonated in the exoatmosphere, high-altitude nuclear EMP called HEMP, one of the phenomenon that happens is very similar to a phenomenon that the sun can produce when it produces a coronal mass ejection, or what we might sometimes hear as a solar flare. Whether it's a nuclear weapon or a coronal mass ejection, it strikes the Earth's magnetosphere, and the movement of that magnetosphere generates electromagnetic energy in the crust of the Earth. So we may be looking up and seeing a flash or a beautiful aurora, and beneath our feet is this current traveling, looking for the path of least resistance. It finds that path of least resistance in our electric grid, travels up through the neutral wire of our extremely high voltage and hard to replace transformers, and enters the grid that way. So GIC is the threat that we seek to mitigate with this bill. The method by which it would be mitigated, the good news is this: it is a fixable problem. There is technology that's been proven and tested that can block that current. But you don't know what needs to be blocked where unless you survey the system. Currently, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, NERC, has a standard for protecting against GIC. I'd like to address your attention to the color table there that shows the difference between the standard and what the real threat is. Now, these transformers we seek to protect, some of them have lead times as long as 4 to 6 years, extremely hard to replace. And unfortunately, on an annual basis, our nation suffers about $10 billion in economic loss from naturally occurring solar weather, those same GICs that pass through the transformer and reduce its lifespan and harm downstream equipment. So we're losing $10 billion every year as a nation. And if that GIC is extremely strong, like what you see on this chart on the right, it can catastrophically damage those transformers, creating very, very long blackouts. To address your attention to this table, the NERC standard has a scaling factor that results in New Hampshire, where we are now, having just over 2 volts per kilometer per protection. What that means is that the utility industry can comply with this federally approved standard without actually having to install any protective hardware. What the bill does is it compels the utility industry to use their existing models, which they use to comply with the federal standard, but instead of plugging in that number that the standard requires, which is transparently low, instead it would plug in the realistic number of 85 volts per kilometer, which just this last May 2025, was the internationally accepted IEC standard for E3 hemp, or high altitude EMP. Why would we want to give that number of 85? Because we can take care of protecting our grid against the worst threat, which is nuclear EMP E3. And while we do that, we completely solve the problem of solar weather. One last point, it's not illustrated here, but I will say when NERC developed its standard for solar storm protection against GIC, 8 scientists that NERC employed to develop that standard recommended initially that it be at the rate of 30 to 40 volts per kilometer. So if you look at that chart, that would be way higher than what we have now, right? And so, again, all this bill does is it asks the utilities really to do their job, right? They should be assessing their system for all sorts of vulnerabilities, but specifically as it relates to GIC, to assess the system to the realistic threat. And in keeping with the CEII requirements, with the confidential requirements for information, making sure that only the right parties have the information that is needed to make the decisions on how then to protect it. The good news, as I mentioned before, proven technology exists to mitigate this threat. It's affordable. I personally have briefed the federal government more than a half a dozen times, and unfortunately they haven't acted. And so at this point, we believe that it's important for the states to take action from the bottom up. So at this point, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have about the threat, about the solutions, and about the policy that is being recommended today.
Thank you for that testimony. I'm sure we do have some questions, and I'm going to start the questioning myself. So you have defined on page 2, lines 9 through 16, something you call CEII, which means Critical Energy Infrastructure Information Protocols. And then later in the bill, also on page 2, line 37, you mentioned that information that needs to be collected can be redacted for CEII. Can you help me understand, is that enforceable? Is that challengeable in court? Exactly how could we offer our utilities assurance that this information would remain confidential?
Right. Yeah, so the CEII protocols that the utilities use is something they're familiar with, that I have the utmost confidence that if it's the utility industry and the government handling this information, that it will be protected. So this is something that they're very, very adept at doing and very good at making sure that that information stays confidential. I have plenty of examples that I could share if we wanted to, but I don't know if we need to get into those. But when it comes to transparency and public disclosure, there is a very, very rich history of the electric utility industry working with government to not have information shared with the public. So I'm confident that that would be treated with the utmost operational security.
Okay, thank you. Representative Corman had a question.
I do. So you said there's a technology that exists to protect. Is that just for protecting transformers? And can you talk a little bit about the technology, please?
Sure. So the question about technology for this particular threat, the GIC threat, the technology that I'm referencing is called solid ground. This technology has been developed over the last 18 years, roughly, and it's been tested by the federal government, so the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, or DTRA, Idaho National Laboratory, the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and TVA, as well as the industry's research organization, EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute. That technology has been deployed in 3 locations in the United States, so American Transmission Company, the Western Area Power Administration, and the Tennessee Valley Authority. It's operated flawlessly for that period that it's been installed. And what we've actually seen, Representative Corman, is some of these most recent solar storms where we might predict that the effects of the GIC, traditionally we think of GIC affecting the North American continent, where it would be worse in the northern latitudes and it would diminish as you go south. And that's how the NERC standard is developed. That's why you see right here that scaling factor where as you go south, it gets less. I mean, where I'm from in Louisiana, it's like 0.8 volts per kilometer. What we've seen is those devices activating in southern latitudes even before the northern latitudes activate with some of these recent storms. So the point being that the technology works, it's proven, it's been tested. Other countries are deploying the technology. On Monday of this week, I sent a letter to the Department of Energy to warn them of additional evidence we found of the People's Republic of China deploying this across their grid. Imprimis is the manufacturer. The company has received a number of requests from foreign nations to manufacture and provide their solid ground technology. In December, I went and witnessed the last test of one of the devices they had just completed. I actually took a AA battery out of the flashlight in my pocket and touched it to the unit, and it activated perfectly. It was extremely inspiring. But then it was just as depressing to think that device was being packed up to be shipped to a foreign country, albeit an allied country, but not the United States of America. So that's a long answer to your question. It's meant to protect transformers, which are the backbone of the grid. Here's one of the things that is notable, though. It doesn't just protect the transformers against the catastrophic levels of GIC that would ruin the transformer. It blocks all GIC. So that AA battery, it blocked that direct current. What that means is that the deployment nationwide of solid ground would save the American economy $10 billion a year. And what it would cost is a one-time $3 to $4 billion price tag for the whole country, which was about 1/3 of 1% of the infrastructure bill. And these are things that I've briefed to the Department of Energy before. So the solution exists. It's been thoroughly tested. It's been deployed in at least 3 locations in the United States, and it, we believe, needs to be deployed nationwide.
Follow up?
Follow up.
Is this device, once it's used, is it reusable, or is it more like a fuse where once it's blown, you got to replace it?
Oh, Representative, that's a great question. Okay, so the way solid ground works is there's a number of operating modes that it can be on, but if you put it in the automatic mode where it detects that GIC, it's going to block as many times as it needs to protect for as long duration as necessary. And so what I witnessed when I saw that test was exactly that procedure. So it's not a one-time, like a fuse like you're mentioning that might blow and then you got to buy another one. This device, at least the ones that have been installed at ATC for over 10 years, it doesn't even really require maintenance. It's just plug it in, and set it and forget it, so to speak. Now, I will say that the installation process is also something that's pretty simple. The utility will put down a concrete pad ahead of time for the device to sit on somewhere in the substation. And then all they have to do is take the wire that connects to the device and just connect it to the neutral that's stuck in the ground from that transformer. The transformer can be running full speed. So it's literally can be installed in an operating grid without interrupting anything and be activated right there, ready to go. Do the battery test and walk away, and it's ready to go.
Representative McGee has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for taking my question. So is this device, is the solid ground technology, is that rated to do this up to this 85 volts per kilometer?
Yes, ma'am. So the history behind the development of the device, the company Crown Ironworks, 4 generations, did a lot of work for the U.S. over the World War I, World War II period. And the founders of this particular company, Imprimis, was a similar threat briefing to the one I've provided to lawmakers about this threat. They were inspired to want to be able to address the biggest part of the EMP issue, take the biggest chunk of it and solve it technologically with their invention. And so from the very beginning, what they envisioned was creating something that would protect against the worst case scenario. And in fact, it's not illustrated here, but when we talk about solar weather, what we think of as a bad solar storm would be like the 1859 Carrington event, where the telegraph operators reported sparks coming off the telegraphs and fires were started. And if you look down at your chart, that would have been what you see in yellow there, right? That's what we think of as that level. There's something called a Miyake event, which in the course of Earth's history, there have been massive solar storms, way stronger than anything you see on this chart. The developers of Solid Ground developed that technology to protect against that level. So if you could measure the protection, it would be way off the chart of this page in terms of the protection you get by installing the device.
Representative Thomas has a question.
Thank you, Representative Wendy Thomas. Thank you for being here. And I have some questions really concerning the utilities, which may or may not be surprising. So at the end of page 2, you define the reports, define the elements of the report, and the scope and the timing and the cost. So my question is, could this bill impose undue regulatory burdens without funding for the utilities or any statutory authority under existing state utility law?
So I think the answer would be no. At this point, I guess you would have to ask yourself, does the state at this point pay for the utilities to comply with the NERC standard, or do they do that on their own? Because the procedures for this survey are just to take the same procedures that they take to abide by the NERC standard and just plug in the real number. So theoretically, that shouldn't cost you. They're doing it already to comply with that standard.
Follow up.
Follow up.
And I also do not see any enforcements or legal consequences for any missed reports or inadequate assessments.
It's a good catch. That might be something to add.
A follow-up
Thank
on
you.
Representative Thomas's question. Is there anything in this proposed legislation at the moment that would preclude adding a section to allow the utilities to recover costs from ratepayers for doing this assessment report?
So that, yes, as far as the question related to how to pay for it, towards the end, one of the things that you'll see there is that the report asks the utilities for their recommended solutions, and then for the total cost, the priority list, and then their recommendations for funding, which could be potentially grant sources, rate recovery mechanisms. So what the bill does is actually ask the utilities, hey, help us understand, how you see the best way to pay for this. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Representative Thomas has another question.
Thank you, Representative Wendy Thomas. And so electric grid reliability and transformer standards are already subjected to oversight by federal bodies. You mentioned FERC and NERC. Do you anticipate legal debates that could arise over state versus federal on this, whether or not New Hampshire can mandate reporting and assessments that overlap with federal regulations?
There could be, I could anticipate that there would be some people who would want to debate it, but I don't think it needs to be debated. The regulatory process between NERC and FERC is very time consuming. Just the vegetation management standard that was established after the Great Northeast Blackout, August 14, 2003, you all may remember that was a single point of failure from a tree branch in Ohio. That process between NERC and FERC to establish an enforceable regulatory standard for vegetation management, it took about 9.5 years. And so the idea here is to try to expedite the understanding of how we can protect the grid in New Hampshire and not subject ourselves to that unduly time-consuming process that the federal government has used.
I have a follow-up.
Follow-up?
Thank you. So we're talking about the grid in New Hampshire, but it sounds like this is a national problem. What's the pushback on a federal level for doing this?
You know, ma'am, I haven't experienced pushback. When I briefed Secretary Granholm, for example, I mean, she was very polite and smiled and, you know, even gave us a thumbs up. I think when it came to the previous administration, there were a lot of investments being made in other things that that they imagine took higher priority, but there was never really any pushback. It wasn't like a hostile reaction. In terms of the current Department of Energy folks that I've briefed, similarly, very well received, enthusiastic about trying to figure out the solution. I guess the track record we have as a nation is that things at the federal level take a long time. But I think where your question was also going, ma'am, is that, you know, the electrons don't care about state boundaries. They don't care about political parties, right? And so this truly will have to be something that ought to be addressed regionally, you know, but it's got to start somewhere, and this is the first in the nation state, and that's why I'm honored to be here to help you start it.
Vice Chair Thomas has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just for clarification, you made a statement that the information and the process is already being done by all utilities, and that all they have to do is to use the right number. Is it, in fact, just a simple case of going to their formula and replacing one number with other, pushing a button, and the report will be generated? Or is there something more to it? I'm a little bit confused as what has to be done.
Yeah, so the utility industry has operating models that they use, and they've established those models for compliance to the NERC standard right now. So just putting that number in would be one step. Now, the bill does tell them that they need to look at other factors, because when it comes to GIC vulnerability, the age of the transformer is a factor. There are lots of factors that could make that transformer more vulnerable to GIC. And so when I essentially took this request to help figure out what needed to be in the bill, I pushed it out to engineers from across the utility industry that I knew, to experts on solar weather, EMP, and I asked them for the inputs, like, hey, what's all the most significant characteristics of a transformer that need to be looked at to figure out how to triage? And that's what you see in the bill, right? So one part is putting in the right number, but there are other steps like looking at its age, its design. And so that list of requirements is going to give the industry a really good sense of which ones need to be protected the most.
Thank you for the follow-up. So in other words, then, do you still maintain that the extra steps that would need to be done would be at virtually no additional cost, or do you suspect there might be some additional cost?
So if you're looking at making a spreadsheet where you go through and you put the age of the transformer, where it was manufactured, you know, the purpose of the transformer, it'd be kind of hard for me to imagine that they don't already have that somewhere in a spreadsheet. So I can't imagine that. I mean, if they have employees on staff that are paid salary to maintain accountability of their equipment, I can't imagine it would be a lot more to just have them put it in this format. You know, I just I wouldn't see that this would be unduly costly.
Representative Corman has a question.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again for taking my question. So this bill has some very specific numbers in it. 100 kilovolts or greater, 25 MVA, I'm not sure what that is. Talking about a waveform in a particular figure, magnetic field strength.
Right.
Normally, if I'm voting on a bill, I understand what's in the bill and I understand the numbers in the bill. Now, I actually have a PhD in electrical engineering, but it really was computer science, not double E, and definitely not power electronics. But the thing is, it's hard for me to imagine voting for or against a bill when I don't really understand it. So I'm wondering, how am I going to understand these numbers so I can make a decision?
Sure. Well, I guess we can start with, and I don't know how much time we have, but what I would suggest is we just start with volts per kilometer, right? Because that's what NERC uses. So if we think about the current standard that is there to protect the electric grid from GIC, the volts per kilometer that are being plugged in are based on where you're at in your state. The scaling factor that's being used, you can see there in the northern states like Maine, Minnesota, it'd be 4 volts per kilometer. So imagine a transmission line, and for every kilometer, that number of volts is building up, right? And then inducing into that infrastructure. And so when you look at the numbers that we have here, 85 volts per kilometer is what is recommended with that IEC standard, right? So that's the real comparison, is the current standard that the utilities abide by, which again, they can comply with the standard and not have to install any kind of protection. But the grid remains vulnerable. That in New Hampshire is about 2.4 volts per kilometer. Somewhere in that range is between 2 and 4. Where the real threat, no matter whether it's a Carrington class solar storm, the 1921 solar storm, you know, that solar storm produced about 20 volts per kilometer in 1921. Carrington would be larger. A Miyake event would be far larger. The Soviets achieved 66 volts per kilometer with their nuclear tests, and then 85 is the new standard for Hemp E3. So that's one way. I mean, I do realize this is a technical document, and it was created with the input from a lot of technical experts. But for as much time as y'all need, I'd be happy to continue to explain. But that's probably the key, is using the NERC measurement, you know, because volts per kilometer is what they use. So 85 is what we suggest here.
Additional questions, Representative Bernardi.
Mr. Chair, so the 85 is what you've suggested, or the bill suggests, but you indicated that the imprimis solid ground unit has greater protection capacity than that.
Right.
What is for the Miyake or whatever?
You know, the Miyake events, I'd have to go back and look and see how many volts per kilometer. But when I looked at a table that compared Miyake to Carrington, it was like the comparison between NERC and the IEC standard, right?
Okay. And so the imprimis event or a primus unit can
That's right.
accommodate
Like
that?
the absolute worst case.
We do have pink cards from Unitil and Eversource, so we'll be hearing from them later on in our testimony. Representative McGee.
Mr. Chairman, thanks again. So this bill looks like it's relatively preliminary, right? It's asking our in-state utilities to help us create an assessment of the vulnerabilities of the system. So then there would need to be follow-on work, discussion, legislation eventually to understand what we would then do in terms of taking any action, right? Because there would be costs associated with that.
Right.
So that's what you're looking at, is just trying to implement the idea of having the state tell us what our vulnerabilities are.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, ma'am. For the utilities to basically say, hey, we modeled this according to the realistic threat. Here's what we found would be the cost to fix it, and here are all of our recommendations for how to pay for that. I mean, we're literally inviting the utility industry to ask for help.
Representative Thomas.
Thank you, Representative Wendy Thomas. I have 2 questions. One is a clarifying question. You mentioned that New Hampshire is first in the nation. Did you mean that because we're politically, or that no other state has implemented this at this point?
Both. Yes, ma'am. You're the first state to file this specific bill.
Follow up.
Follow up.
And I've looked through the bill, and maybe I'm missing it, but who receives this report? And are there security issues with this kind of information escaping the utilities?
Yeah, if the information were to be put in the wrong hands, then you absolutely could have security issues, and that's why CEII is highlighted. In terms of who it goes to, it's for the state to decide. This committee, if you have specific entities within the state that you think should be the right ones to receive it, then this is where I would encourage you to think about who that should go to.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
So lines 29 through 30 specify that each covered entity shall submit a report to the Department of Energy with copies to the Public Utilities Commission, the governor, the chief of Homeland Security, and the legislature.
Yeah. Yes, that's what I say. I mean, this may be the time for you to say, okay, well, is there like one committee in the legislature or something that you, yeah.
Okay, additional questions. Vice Chair Thomas.
Mr. Chair, thank you for taking my question. You mentioned earlier about the NCSL and their adoption. Would you explain what you meant by that for the benefit of the committee and how that would affect this bill?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's an inspiring story where legislators who were presented a real threat got together at the National Conference of State Legislators and developed a resolution, and coming from here in New Hampshire, that called upon our government to solve this problem, but to do so identifying the longest lead time assets and prioritizing those first. And then that's what led our coalition to take that resolution and start to ask ourselves, well, how do we help them do that? Let's look at what are the longest lead time assets. Okay, transformers, right? What are the solutions? What are the vulnerabilities? And so it was that resolution by a unanimous vote from a nationwide conference asking for this to be solved that inspired us to start helping figure out how to solve it. And the good news is that I didn't just bring this to you guys. I mean, the results of all that I brought to the Department of Energy as well. I mean, I'm doing everything I can to work it top down and bottom up. It's just the track record top down has been slow. And I also think that, the states that can provide this information, let's say the federal government just decides, you know what, we're going to do it. We're just going to fix this. We're going to take care of this problem. The states that are ready to say what they need might be the first one to receive what the federal government has to offer. I can't say that for sure, but it sort of makes sense, right? Like if you till the soil, right? So that's kind of the idea.
After Vice Chair Thomas does a quick follow-up here, I think we're going to move on because we need to hear from some other folks, and we're running out of time. So follow-up.
Thank you. Really quick. So as a result of the resolution that came from New Hampshire, it would be the impetus of why you're introducing the bill to New Hampshire first. Is that correct?
I mean, look, yeah, we're here first because y'all asked for it. I mean, this lawmaker to my right said, hey, help me figure this out. Help me figure out a solution. And you all invited us to come and do our job with that uncompromised analysis. And in this case, a solution, I think that's all not that unconventional. It seems pretty common sense.
All right, I want to thank you for your testimony. Representative Parshall has a question.
Thank you, Chair. I have a question for the chair, if I may. And that is, can we recall the testifier after hearing from Eversource and Unitil if further questions arise?
We have time, yes.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks to the two of you for your testimony. Next, we're going to hear from Unitil, and I'm going to call Alec O'Meara to give us his perspective on this proposed legislation.
Good afternoon. All right, I got the microphone on the first try. We're already doing well. For the record, my name is Alec O'Meara. I am the Director of External Affairs at Unitil. We have no formal position on this bill for a very specific reason. That is that we only have a handful of devices on our system, less than 5, that would be covered on the language of this bill. That's largely because what this bill is looking at is high voltage equipment, the transmission system. So really everything above us would likely be covered, and it's really just that connection point. And that tracks with everything I know in terms of solar flares and electromagnetic, in that the higher the voltage, then the potential higher the overall vulnerability is on devices like this. So that makes good sense to me. I first heard of this particular topic. It was actually very early in my career at Unitil. I think it was within my first year, actually. I received an inquiry from a reporter that was asking about this particular topic. And it was the first I had heard about it, specifically asking about solar flares. And immediately, because I wasn't that far from my reporter days, I went on a deep rabbit hole learning all about it. And I found it fascinating. It's a really interesting topic. One of the key things I did learn as part of that deep dive is the process that exists right now to protect the system from this kind of solar flare or electromagnetic phenomenon. And that is you shut it down. ISO New England, and in the years since, there's been a handful of times where I have gotten a heads up from my dispatch folks because of my communications role, looking at what happens. You know, if we are seeing a geomagnetic disturbance, a solar flare, if you will, there's an element of readiness that we have in place should it escalate to a point. The fastest and safest way to avoid the threat is simply to de-energize the system. The Carrington event is so called the Carrington event because the astronomer, George Carrington, had noticed a flash on the sun approximately 18 hours prior to the actual flare that caused the telegraph to go haywire and all of that. So there is an opportunity to know that there is the potential risk for something like this to occur, and then to be able to then shut it down. I bring all of that up just because I do note in this particular language here, it says that covered entities shall not rely solely on the operational procedures such as load shedding or reactive power supply to mitigate GIC risk. Sorry, a lot of acronyms in this one, even for me. I ask why. I think that that's a fair question to ask because to me, a lot of what is in here goes to the same comments that Mr. Elliott with DOE was making yesterday, in that there's a real balancing act on a lot of this stuff between reliability and affordability. And yes, there are things that utilities can do that can protect against all manner of things, but then the question becomes, is the cost to implement that worth the potential risk to the system? Would it make energy unaffordable because of what you would have to potentially implement? And considering this particular incident does advocate for this specific physical solution, I would wonder whether or not it isn't worth looking at what existing mitigation efforts also exist, just in, you know, are they sufficient? When I first heard about this, I came away feeling that these opportunities to shed load effectively were sufficient in terms of protecting the overall infrastructure. Now, I recognize that if we're talking about a nuclear blast, that may or may not be the same thing, but I think if there was a nuclear blast, there'd probably be bigger things to worry about. That's exactly right. The only other thing that I noticed as I was going through this, and this is just as a research person, I was curious as to the specific numbers, similar to what you brought up, Representative Corman. I know the Carrington event was something like 1,000 nanoteslas. Now, I couldn't tell you what a nanotesla is, but I noted that in this language, it goes to 20,000 nanoteslas. I was wondering why. I now know why. It's because it's looking at events much, much larger than that. That's interesting. That's good to know. But really, that's all I wanted to share. This doesn't really directly affect us. Our report would be relatively minor compared to what Eversource would be, and I defer to them in terms of a lot of what pulling this data together would look like. But that's what I can provide from where I'm sitting on the infrastructure. Happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you. You referred to some specific text in the bill.
Yes, sir.
Could you mention the page and line number?
Page 3, lines 10 through 12.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And I have a follow-up question, a slightly different question. The folks who introduced the bill said that utilities are already gathering much of this information. Is that your understanding? Do you think your company already has a lot of this information at hand?
In the preliminary conversations I had as part of my research, one of the first things I did hear folks in our engineering team say is that we would likely need a consultant of some sort on our end. Now, that was just anecdotal and conversational, so I don't know if that would or would not be the case. Again, I know that there would certainly be a lot more devices that would be affecting Eversource, so I defer to them in terms of the scale of this work. I can only add on top of that, I personally have learned whenever I hear anyone say it's easy for a utility to do something, it isn't necessarily the case.
Answer, thank you. Representative Corman has a question.
Thank you. This is an easy one, I think. I just want clarification. When you say that the current protections process is to shut the system down, you're talking about just cutting power to everybody, all your customers, and just de-energizing the entire system?
Load shed, yes, sir, that's correct. That is ISO New England calls and dictates for when there are situations where you might need to shed overall load. Again, this is a transmission level conversation. We're on the receiving end of those types of orders. Typically, they are brought up in situations where there may be a capacity deficiency or something happening on the system where it appears that more electricity is going to be used than is being generated at a given time. And that's to overall just protect the infrastructure from something that would be a cascading failure, not unlike this. So this is a situation where in the event you saw something catastrophic, you would then be directed to shed load. Again, that load shed would happen probably before our system. It's just something that we would be aware of and prepared for.
Follow up? So again, just to make sure I understand, this would not be a decision that Unitil would make. It would be a decision that ISO New England makes?
That is correct.
So we're relying on them to understand that an event has occurred.
We get updates in terms of whether or not there are geomagnetic disturbances occurring. I know that's something that we hear from regularly. So this is, again, I've seen these updates come in from dispatch due to my communications role.
Representative Thomas.
Representative Wendy Thomas. Thank you for being here, first of all. And my question was also about the de-energizing the system. You've done this in the past, I assume, and what kind of a time frame are we looking at here? Are we talking about minutes, hours, days?
So let's start with the first bit of that. No, this has never happened before. I want to be clear on that. I don't believe there's ever been an instance throughout New England where any sort of load shedding has happened regarding a geomagnetic disturbance, a capacity deficiency, anything of the sort. My basic understanding on terms of a geomagnetic disturbance is that the overall duration of a potential incident is relatively brief. You know, a flare itself, you could be at risk for an extended period, but the actual duration is relatively brief. And again, these are better questions for the transmission folks in terms of what duration would occur. But it is something that exists that is a potential mitigation for this potential once-in-a-generation event.
Thank you very much.
Okay, seeing no further questions, I want to thank you for your testimony and call next on Eversource, who will be represented by Michael Licata, Brian Dickey, and Dave Cloutier. Welcome, gentlemen.
Good afternoon.
I hope I didn't mispronounce anyone's name.
Close. Good afternoon. Michael Licata. I'm the Director of Government and Community Relations for Eversource. Joining me today is Brian Dickey, who is our Vice President of Electric Operations, and Dave Cloutier, who is our Director of System Operations. And I guess I just want to start out first by saying we really do appreciate the bill sponsor and the bill co-sponsors' focus and passion and concern over this critical issue. We think it's critically important that there is awareness and understanding of the threats that geomagnetic and electromagnetic events can cause on the electric grid. And I also just want to start off by saying I want to assure folks both on the committee and in the public that there is a great deal of work that has been done on this issue, on evaluating grid vulnerabilities as well as response plans. And those have been done in conjunction with NERC, as you've heard, and ISO New England. And I'm just going to turn it over to Brian briefly to kind of walk through some of the assessments and evaluations that we have done and how those are developed and implemented. We do have a few concerns with the language as written in the bill that I'll outline after that. So I'll turn it over to Brian now.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having us. Yeah, so as far as the studies at the transmission level, we do have models as part of the NERC standard. We are required to do a study every 5 years, assess the system at the transmission level, and develop any mitigating solutions. Now, the NERC standard is predicated on geomagnetic storms, not high voltage nuclear type device, geomagnetic induced currents. So that study is, limited to a 12 volt per kilometer threshold with, studies being done and scaling being done depending on the elevation you are in from a latitude perspective to magnetic north. One of the things in the NERC standard that's very discrete is the threshold for the study. So the threshold for the study is to study everything from a 200 kV threshold and above with grounded Y primary windings. So it's very discrete, right? What's in the bill is a little bit different and would not apply to just transmission. It would apply to distribution. So that's one concern. So we have models, and the reason why I mention that is we have models on the transmission system with all the DC components that would go into that model. On the distribution system, we do not have that. We would have to go out and obtain that data, which would take a considerable time and effort in order to get that data and create a model to model the distribution system, and do the study. On the transmission level, again, we do have that information. We have the data. I don't know if it's just a matter of plugging in a new value. I'm sure there's a little bit more to it than that. And I don't know if the time period of 180 days after bill's passage is doable. I'd have to go back and ask our engineering department, what the criteria is there for that.
Just to walk through some specific concerns with the bill as written and introduced, and we'd be very happy to obviously work with the bill sponsor, work with the committee to try and address these concerns.
Excuse me, I'm going to interrupt you briefly. Someone has a question before we move on.
Oh, sure.
Representative Bernardi.
Mr. Chairman, so you said you have the data to help support the transmission system assessment, but distribution, no. How many units in the distribution system would you have to go out and get data for?
Well, it's not only the units, it's the system itself. We'd have to model, the entire DC component of that system, right? So the entire distribution system.
I'm trying to understand how big the elephant is.
We're talking probably 90 transformers at least, and all the distribution components of that system, all the lines and everything, the DC component of those lines.
Thank you.
And it's just because of the way it's written. If it was written a different way, like the NERC standard, then that is removed.
Representative Reynolds wants to follow up on that.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Another thing that we talk a lot about here, with different legislation, the interconnection process for, say, companies that want to put, distributed generation, solar or something else on the system, they have to apply. And the utilities respond by evaluating, well, if you want to connect that here, you might have to upgrade this transformer. I find it difficult to hear that you don't have the information about the transformers on your distribution system.
So we have an AC model, right? It was an alternating current model.
Okay.
And all the impedances, whatnot. We do not have the DC component, which is a little bit different than the AC component of all of that information. So all I'm saying is we'd have to go out and obtain that information. My understanding is when they did the transmission study and went out and obtained that information, it took some time to do. So relating that to the distribution system, if that's what we have to do.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, please continue.
Thank you. So just walking through some of the specific language on the bill. First and foremost, as Brian pointed out, the 180-day, this is on page 2, line 29, days after passage, the report shall be provided. Again, that time frame we think might create some challenges for us. We did have similar questions, as you heard from Unitil, about the 20,000 nanotesla, 85 volt per kilometer, and sort of where that was coming from, why there was such a big discrepancy from the approved NERC standard that is used across the country and implemented through ISO New England for our current studies. So again, that's a much higher standard, and as you heard, potentially there would be other impacts that folks would be dealing with if that were to occur. Sticking with page 2 on lines 30 and 31, this also did come up. We did have concerns about providing information to Public Utilities Commission, the governor. It says Chief of Homeland Security. I think you would want that to be the Director of the Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Management, and all 424 members of the New Hampshire State Legislature, which goes into sort of the next concern, which is on the same page, starting at line 33. There it is. Extremely detailed in the amount of information and specificity of the information on our transformers that we are being told to provide. Now, it does say that we should comply with essentially critical infrastructure confidentiality. I guess I question the necessity of having that information included to begin with at that level of detail. That said, we work very closely with the Department of Energy on cybersecurity plans and other grid infrastructure protection plans. So, that's something we could work with them on to provide. But, this broader audience, as called for in the bill, I think would be concerning. Also included in the assessment on line 7 on page 3, a priority list of transformers by damage risk and critical infrastructure impact. A similar concern that we would not want to disclose that publicly. Then just moving down, the actual reference to CEII protocols as defined in RSA 378A:2. I'm assuming that's a typo. I don't think there is a 378A:2. I just think that probably Legislative Services needs to clean that up. What's that? Oh, I see. That's helpful. Thank you. I went to the RSAs to see if there was an existing standard. No, thank you. I appreciate that. Is similar to Unitil. I think we did have concerns about why load shedding is eliminated as a mitigation strategy. Again, that is currently the strategy that utilities employ as directed by ISO New England, should there an event occur. And then finally, I think there is, it was a question that was raised about cost recovery and sort of cost allocation. And so, there is a sort of open question about a state directing a transmission owner to do work that would be recoverable through rates, which would be approved by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Now, the cost of the study is one component. The other component is we're supposed to come up with some recommendations with costs associated with implementation. The costs, if the State of New Hampshire were to tell us to install specific devices at specific costs, those would be, as you heard from ISO New England, recovered through the transmission rate, which is set by FERC. And so you kind of have a jurisdictional issue associated with that. That said, I fully recognize that the legislation is just calling for an assessment at a specific level. the one last thing I would kind of conclude with is just, as Brian talked about, we do have studies that have been done. Information is shared with obviously our regulators. We'd be happy to work with the Department of Energy, Public Utilities Commission, Department of Homeland Security. As I said, we do work very closely with them on other mitigation strategies and grid threat assessments. And we'd be happy to answer any questions that the committee may have.
Okay, thank you. I have a quick question regarding your comments about lines 30 and 31. You think it might be more appropriate to have this information available to the Department of Energy and possibly the Public Utilities Commission, but not the governor, the chief of Homeland Security, and the legislature?
I think that would be helpful. I would have to check with our folks on the inclusion of Homeland Security. As I said, we work pretty closely with them, especially on cybersecurity issues. So there might be some value in sharing information with them.
Representative Bernardi has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The issue of load shedding is a little troubling to me. It's my understanding of solar EMP is we have maybe a couple of minutes from the coronal event to the time you need to shed. Is ISO New England going to be able to shut down the entire grid? Because that's what it would take. You can't just shut off little pieces of the utilities. You have to shut everything down. And then in the event of a nuclear blast, there is no warning. If one of the North Korean satellites decides to blow up in the middle of the United States and wipe out all of the United States grid, it's gone. And there's no warning. There's no time to load shed. How do you deal with that?
All right, so there's two issues there, right? The first is the solar event, right? So we have, obviously in contemporary times, more monitoring of the sun and more advanced notice. And it does take some time for a coronal mass ejection to get to the Earth. There's some dependency on the magnetic field strength at the time of the Earth. There's a whole bunch of variables in there, but there is some time. So we do get notice, pretty far in advance of when a magnetic storm is about to approach. And, we have system operators 24/7 looking at the system. They are watching VAR flow. So VAR flow is a component of power where current is flowing. I don't want to get too deep into it, but, we do get indication on the system if there is, excessive current on the system and excessive reactive VAR flow, right? So the operators could take action. You wouldn't kill everything. You'd kill a piece of equipment or de-energize a piece of equipment, right? So that it wouldn't get damaged. For a nuclear device, that's a different scenario, and well outside my expertise, right? That would be something of a national security issue, I would think, and something I couldn't really give you an expert opinion
on. So again, then load shedding in event of the solar event, it's the big pieces of the system, the big transformers, which means they're feeding all the distribution downstream. So if you kill them, you've killed the whole system. You haven't taken out a little component. Can you explain how you said?
Well, again, it's connected to the greater system, right? So the whole Eastern Interconnect is interconnected. If you opened up some transformers, say at Scobie Pond, right, you're still connected to the system, right? It depends how much of that system is being impacted and how much of the system is being de-energized at the same time.
Okay.
Representative Partial.
Chair Vos, I have a question as far as discussing the appropriateness of a study like this and where it would actually be more effective? We are talking about load shedding at ISO New England. Would it be more effective if somebody like that organization undertook a study of this nature?
Well, we would do the study. We work with ISO New England to do the study. Our engineers work on it. As mentioned, we just completed a study. We also had an outside vendor verify that study to make sure it was accurate based on the NERC standard. Again, the one thing on the NERC standard is it's very discrete, grounded Y, 200 kV or greater, which limits the study to transmission only. The way the bill is written, 100 kV, no indication of the winding configuration, ends up pushing the study into the distribution realm. And quite honestly, on the distribution realm, it's not a grounded Y primary we have there. We have a delta connected primary, which is completely different. Right.
And just to follow up, the study and the assessment that Brian just referenced. So when NERC published the standard, which is, by the way, available to the public on NERC's website, I think it's 38 pages long if folks want to review it. At that point, ISO New England contacted all the transmission owners, set up a process, which I believe took 4 years, for each of the transmission owners and covered entities to do and complete that assessment. And then that information was provided back to ISO in terms of grid vulnerability. So just to say that the existing process, the existing assessment does flow through ISO New England as the regional grid operator.
For clarification, did I understand you to say, Mr. Dickey, that changing the number 100 on line 4, page 2, line 4 to 200 would...
That and the winding configuration, right? So the winding configuration is important too. Remember, as mentioned in the previous testimony from the colonel, you know, he was talking about auto transformers, high voltage transformers with grounded Y connections, right? So on our distribution system, we have many transformers that are connected to the transmission system and convert the voltage from high voltage 115 or 345 down to a distribution voltage of 34.5 kV. The primary windings on those transformers are delta connected, meaning there's no connection to ground. The secondary side has a grounded connection, but that's not how this reads. It just says primary voltage of 100 kV or greater capacity and a capacity of 25 MVA. That's a little bit different than the NERC standard and how it's written. So this pushes the study down and would create, you know, more cost.
Okay, thank you. Follow up, Representative Reynolds.
So, in your opinion, you're an electrical expert person, is the bill sponsors, is the definition or the thresholds, the net being cast by this spec in the bill over broad? Does it not need to be that broad?
Well, it depends what the bill is trying to do, right?
Depends
So,
on what-
right. So I don't know. So when I heard, you know, the previous parties talk, right, they were talking about transmission studies, and the way this is written is it impacts distribution. So it depends what the bill is trying to do.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman?
If I could just add one thing, you know, one of the reasons we talk about transmission as being a vulnerable infrastructure to these type of events is one, the voltage, and Brian obviously can explain this so much better than I can, but one is the voltage, but also the distance. And so Brian, I don't know if you want to touch on how the distribution system is a little bit different than transmission there.
Yeah. So if you think about what these studies do, right, they're looking at induced currents in the earth plane, and it's the extra high voltage is more susceptible, and the length of lines are more susceptible. So if you look at transmission, they're long, very long lines, and it depends what the orientation of those lines and substations are. So these GIT currents, because they're geomagnetic, will run west to east, or if you're near a large body of water like the Atlantic Ocean, they can run through the ocean, come into the lines, and that's where you get the induced current. So from that perspective, Transmission lines are more susceptible. Distribution lines obviously run all over the place. They go east, they go west, they go north, south, they meander right through the communities, where transmission is in right-of-ways, and they're running a beeline from one station to another.
Okay. Thank you.
Representative Thomas has a question.
Representative Wendy Thomas, thank you. Can you we heard from Unitil that they have a process to protect from solar flares. Can you just assure me that you have a published research process in the event of a solar flare?
Yes, we have an operating procedure, operating 20, which I think it's 20, right? So we get notification from the NOAA, right? They have looking at all the geostationary, the Earth itself, and what's coming our way. They have a network to get that out to NPCC, which gets that to ISO and gets that to us, right? So once that's triggered, we go into enhanced monitoring, right, where we're looking at reactive wire flows, making sure nothing's coming out of spec, make sure we're not getting any heating on our transformers. So on our transformers, we measure current, voltage, temperature, winding temperature. So we have all that information coming in real time to our system in the control room. And we would take proactive actions in order to mitigate anything that's coming our way or any system impacts we see happening.
Thank you.
Okay. Seeing no more pink cards on this issue, I think we're going to bring this public hearing to a close. Oh, I guess Vice Chair Thomas has another question.
Best to make it quick, but thanks for the question. I guess the previous speaker alluded to the cost of what it would take to fix this nationally, which the figure I think was mentioned was $3 or $4 billion, $3 or $4 billion, which in my mind, I could double that because costs always increase. Even at that, it sounds pretty cheap to fix something on that scale of a nature. So I guess I'm trying to understand somewhat reluctance here on trying to identify areas that would help in a national effort to help you mitigate the most extreme case, which in my opinion is not a solar flare, because you're going to get either hours or days notice that it might come, and you can take appropriate action, although not be ideal to shut down the grid, but at least you can take some action. My concern is for the, it might be a low risk, but the catastrophic effect would be just, I couldn't even imagine what this country would be like without power that some entity was able to inflict on us on a no-notice basis, and it wouldn't have to involve a destructive atomic blast. It could be an EMP burst in the air or something like that. So I'm just trying to get a feel for just what you feel it would take to identify, at least at the state level, those components that would help the federal government decide where they would have to put their protection and infrastructure. In a roundabout way, this is the bane of when you try to do something first, when other people may not think there's a big issue, but New Hampshire is kind of leading the way in identifying a concern, and they'd like to identify the concern. I feel like we're the people that are trying to prove that the Earth is round way back. So kind of give me a feel for what you guys can do and what this bill could be turned into in order to provide that type of information from a starting point.
Sure, and maybe I'll just start, and I'm aware that you have several, what I presume will be lengthy hearings after this. So I'll be brief, and maybe Brian might have, or Dave might have something to add. But I guess first and foremost, I don't want to leave the committee with the impression that there is, reluctance, trepidation on behalf of the utility to protect our infrastructure and ultimately our customers, because that's certainly not the case. And we did want to provide background information on what we do today and what we are directed to do at the federal, regional level. Certainly, we did have specific concerns with the bill language, and as I said, we're happy to work with the bill sponsor, with the committee to address those issues. I think Alec, Mr. O'Mara from Unitil put it well. There's a balance. You can't protect against everything. There's a cost of protection, and so as we look to balance the affordability of the services we provide and the reliability of the infrastructure that provides those services, we always take that the costs into account and the risk profile of specific things that occur. So I understand through this bill, and I don't know, Brian and Dave probably have more information than I do, that there is equipment that is able to provide a certain level of service. I think that's something we can look at. Obviously, there are processes in place. I sort of go back to a comment that I made, though, where you're talking about setting requirements to, this is a step towards setting requirements for equipment that would have to be installed at the FERC jurisdictional transmission level and the costs associated with that. And so there's, again, question about, New Hampshire's ability to require those additional protections, especially if you have federal organizations that have a different standard of protection that they're requiring in a different survey. So again, very happy to work with the committee on this language. We're here to be constructive and helpful, but that's a little bit of the background. I don't know, guys, if you want to, no?
No, other than, I echo your remarks, right? We're willing to do we're highly regulated, whether it be from the federal or state level. We're willing to do whatever the regulations require us to do, or whatever the state bodies are looking for us to do, right? It's just a matter of balancing the cost and making sure we keep affordability in mind.
Thank you. Representative Mattson, do you have a question of the chair? Because House rules prohibit you from asking questions of folks who are testifying.
Question for you. If
What
we
is it?
could bring Mr. Waller back up for clarification on some of the points that were made.
I think we'll have to take that offline because
Okay.
We've kind of run out of time here. So
All right, thank you.
appreciate your testimony. And since I have no more pink cards on House Bill 1723, I'm going to close the